This is Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers, with your hosts, Mike Thorne
and Miriam Riche. Craftwork is recorded and produced in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River.
The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel Schroeder.
The Oxford Companion to English Literature describes Ramsey Campbell as Britain's most respected living horror writer, and the Washington Post sums up his work as one of the monumental accomplishments of modern popular fiction. His awards include the Grand Master Award of the World Horror Convention, the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Horror Writers Association, the Living Legend Award of the International Horror Guild, and the World Fantasy Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2015, he was made an Honorary Fellow of Liverpool John Moores University for outstanding services to literature. His latest novels are Fellstones, The Lonely Lands, The Incubations, and An Echo of Children. His Brichester Mythos trilogy consists of The Searching Dead, Born to the Dark, and The Way of the Worm. His collections include Waking Nightmares, Ghosts and Grisly Things, Told by the Dead, Just Behind You, Holes for Faces, By the Light of My Skull, Fearful Implications, and a 2-volume retrospective roundup, Phantasmagorical Stories, as well as The Village Killings and other novellas. His nonfiction is collected as Ramsey Campbell Probably and Ramsey Campbell Certainly, while Ramsey's Rambles collects his video reviews, and Six Stooges and Counting is a book-length study of the Three Stooges. Limericks of the Alarming and Phantasmal is a history of horror fiction in the form of 50 limericks.
Hello, Ramsey.
Miriam,
hi, Ramsey.
Hi. How you doing?
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good. Good to see you too.
Can you hear me? Can
Very
you
clear.
hear me? Yeah?
Very clear indeed. Yes.
Good. Good. I shall remove these then. I don't know. Shall I? Yeah, what the hell? Let's go. Let's go without the technology.
Well, we're extremely grateful to you for making the time. I'm not alone in saying this. I'm a huge admirer of your work. Your presence in the field is just, it's unmatched. It's genuinely such an honor. So thank you so much for making the time.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. You bet.
We know you've discussed this in dozens of interviews, but we always like to ask our guests the following question, which is, what were some of the texts that first got you excited about reading or writing? What were some of your first literary loves, so to speak?
Gosh, how far back do we go? Well, probably all the way back into the mist of senility, I should think. Let me say this at once. I was a hideously precocious child, and I was actually reading fluently at 18 months old, apparently. I used to remember this when I was a kid. I used to remember the Epiphany, in fact, because my mother used to read to me. And it was not, I suppose, very well known in America, but the Rupert Bear stories. There was an animated movie. Paul McCartney did the soundtrack to it, but, that's probably the only things that's travelled internationally. But it was a children's comic. Well, it wasn't a comic, not in the accepted sense. It didn't have speech balloons. It did have panels beneath which you had a paragraph of prose and also a couplet. I think for the less literate, so you just got 2 lines if you couldn't read too well. You got a paragraph of prose if you could read all that. And my mother used to read this to me, and she would trace, what she was reading underneath with a finger. And I used to remember the moment where I suddenly thought, I see how these two things are connected, what she's reading aloud and what is there on the page, and I see it. And I started reading along with her, which took her aback. And then I started reading the stuff she hadn't then yet read aloud. And that really took her aback. And she apparently, so I recall, kind of charged off next door to get the neighbours in to watch this prodigy. Even Wilbur Whateley had nothing on me. So I then was reading. And I still recall that I was almost 2 years old, got a Rupert Bear annual for Christmas. And it had one story in it, which was, basically a little slightly eerie fantasy for children in which Rupert brings it. Well, no, he actually doesn't bring a Christmas tree home, but the Christmas tree comes magically outside his door in a pot, is dutifully taken inside for the Christmas festivities. And on Christmas Day, Rupert hears a little high voice as it seems behind the tree. In fact, it's within it. I knew this already. I was already, already very uneasy about this. The Christmas festivities progress. Rupert goes to bed, wakes in the night, hears a creaking, and looks out the window to see this silhouette prancing off back into the forest. Goes downstairs and finds that the tub is empty, and there's a trail of earth leading out of the front door, which he follows. By which point I was very much hoping he would do nothing of the kind. But the image that really got to me, there's a one in which he's climbing, I can't remember why he should be doing such a thing, but he's climbing up a rock face, and the tree is perched above him, clinging on by its roots, and kind of bending down towards him what it would have if it had a head against this lurid night sky. And I think I had nightmares for weeks, And eventually, but this is, I suppose, what separates the horror aficionado from the general reader. Once this had faded away a bit, I wanted to go back and see it again, read it again. But somehow the book was no longer there, and I assumed that my mother had spotted the effect it was having and had quietly, got rid of it in some way. It wasn't for decades that I searched for this book in a desultory sort of a fashion. Obviously, in those days, no internet. And I happened upon it, as I say, decades later at a book fair in Manchester. And it was £25, which was quite a lot in those days. But I immediately stumped up and got it back to the hotel and started reading the story. And, well, look, I was now 40-something probably. So, it didn't have the same effect. But I could see exactly why it would have had such an effect. Because, you think about it, the creaking in the night, the trail of earth, the sort of scrawny, prancing silhouette. It's all the stuff of, the classic M.R. James English ghost story. And I suppose in the Rupert Bear, it was understated so as not to be too frightening for kids. But it had the opposite effect on me. Because it said so little, it suggested far worse, which again is exactly what M.R. James does, I think, with his reticence. So that was the very first thing. Oh, then years passed. I read Hans Andersen and found his bleakness very disturbing, because he really wasn't writing with children anyway. Those are not tales for kids, half of them. 6 years old, my mother allows me to take books out of the local public library on her adult ticket. And I'm no longer absolutely sure what the first book I borrowed was, but I think it was one of two anthologies. If it was 50 Years of Ghost Stories, I think it may have been, then it was my first encounter with M.R. James and the residents at Whitminster in particular. And again, there was an image in that where somebody is searching through a chest of drawers, and they pull out the bottom drawer. There's just a heap of linen folded up inside, and a little pink hand comes groping out. Sometimes the fact it's a little pink hand rather than a skeleton hand makes it a whole lot worse. I don't exactly know why, but it does. And again, that haunted my nights for weeks. There was Edith Wharton was in there afterward, and I read that and I got it. So I mean, again, as I said, I was horribly precocious. But I'm 6 years old reading Edith Wharton. The other possible first adult book would have been a book called Great Short Stories of the World, in which case I encountered the telltale heart at a tender age, and I certainly felt that was, almost too much, had gone too far, and I don't want my mother seeing what I'm reading, or, this book will be snatched out of my hands. But the other story that really did it, and I, for years, well, decades actually, I ascribed this to Arthur Morrison and his collection Tales of Mean Streets. In fact, there was a story of his in the book, but it wasn't his. There's a story called A Dark Brown Dog. It's actually by Stephen Crane, best known, I think, for The Red Badge of Courage. And it's just this very bleak, naturalistic account of urban slum life in, I think, maybe New York, but I'm not sure. And basically all it is this toddler who befriends this dog and maltreats it rather, but it's very, very just ordinary childish behavior. And his father is something of a drunk. And one evening, the father comes home very drunk, and as I think the story puts it, thinks it would be a good fun to swing the dog around his head with it by its tail. Unfortunately, lets go by the window, and they're on the fifth floor. And the story ends, and this always stuck in my mind, even at the time, and always has since, with the toddler having to go down 5 flights of stone stairs step by step and having to hold on to every stair to get down to the next one. And eventually the story just ends with him cradling the dead dog in his arms. The end. And that kind of did for me, as you may well imagine. So those were some of the experiences of my early reading that have stayed with me indelibly.
That's all fascinating stuff. And I mean, I guess we would be remiss not to also address H.P. Lovecraft. I read or I listened to an interview you did with This Weird House, and you described Lovecraft's aspiration towards awesomeness, which you attributed to his style, his modulation of prose, his approach to the gathering of details, his overall cosmic vision. And I, of course, see these features in your work. Novels like The Hungry Moon and The Nameless come immediately to mind. How do you approach or think about this quality of numinous dread and awe in your fiction? How do you think about it in terms of craft?
Oh, well, gosh. The first thing I have to admit, confession time now, folks, is a lot of it's very instinctive. I mean, that's what I want to convey. And that's what I experience imaginatively. And I suppose to the extent I have learned from Lovecraft, I think it's very much to do with the precise choice of language, particularly in scenes of when you actually bring on your vision, whatever it may be, and reveal it. I mean, first of all, again, very much a classical structure for me, the gradual accumulation of detail and the hints of dread that gradually build up toward the revelation. I think that's one of the most difficult moments to manage, is that shift from the implicit to the explicit in this field. I really do have to work. Well, I work on that, I think, but again, maybe 60 years on, I've developed some kind of a feel for it, and it becomes more instinctive. But certainly, when, in particular, the scenes every so often I do in my own stuff reach for awe, which I think is the highest aspiration of the field. It's like Arthur Machen said, you dream in fire and work in clay, basically, and it always falls short of what you hoped you were going to achieve, but you hope you achieve a little bit of it. And in fact, I mean, I can think of a specific example, an old novel of mine now called Midnight Sun, and for a long, long time, I thought the best I could say about this book was an honourable failure. It just didn't get anywhere close to what I would have liked it to be. But I relatively recently reread it for a reissue, and I was more able to see what was there rather than what I had wanted to be there. And I actually think it brings off more. It gets a bit closer to what I would have wished it had been than I had thought at the time. So perhaps that's just the writer's curse, really, that what you see is what you wished were there rather than what actually is there. Does that kind of, in a rambling way, answer your question? Because, at my age, I forgot what the question is by now.
No, absolutely it does. And I mean, it's kind of, in a way, reassuring to hear you describe that kind of inevitable disparity between the vision or the goal of a piece and then where it ultimately ends up. And it actually builds off another question I had for you from a 2022, ChillerCon interview. You say you don't outline your work in detail and that you often end up writing something much different than what you expected, and you use your story as a companion as an example. I love that story.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned that that's terrific. In that interview, you talked about how you found old notes for it, describing a totally different story from the end product, which you later used to write a new narrative. So I'm really curious about this relationship between like ideation and composition and revision for you. Does it differ from project to project?
Oh, well, more and more instinctive. I keep using this wretched word instinctive, so I'm probably going to have to get used to it. You may hear it a lot before we're through. Yeah, the companion was a very strange instance. One of the earliest, I think, instances of the way that I now generally work. In those days, I did, even then I would gather a lot of material, take lots of notes, lots of ideas. I, play around with the story before I got anywhere near beginning to write it. A lot of, as far as I was, a lot of the process of writing, probably increasingly for me actually, is sorting out from my original note what is going to work. From what will not work, and maybe it might work in a different context. So, for economy's sake, I may keep that material and see if it might be, developed elsewhere. But equally, there are ideas that seem great at the time, and I actually look at them more coldly and think, well, no, that doesn't fit, or that character wouldn't do that, or this does not develop this particular idea, the story, or the story itself in its development will tend to develop beyond some of the ideas I might have had, and they will just have to fall by the wayside because I can't incorporate them. And in the case of the companion, yes, I'd originally had this whole notion of I forget exactly what the differences were, but it certainly the second version ended up utterly different about a lady who lives in a house which turns out to have been built over a demolished fairground, but some of the bits of the fairground have been left buried and begin to surface. Of course, that's nothing like the companion, but those ideas were sort of lying around in the midst of what I ultimately used in that original story. But I mean, these days, more. I mean, really, I don't know. My early novels, were plotted very thoroughly in advance. I mean, chapter by chapter. Partly, I suppose, because also in those days, because obviously I didn't have the track record. I needed to do a sort of synopsis in advance to get a contract. If that was how it worked. I mean, sometimes we did that, sometimes I just wrote the book, but in the main, my agent would try and propose the imminent book to a publisher before it was written. Actually, these days, apart from anything else, I'd much rather write it and then see if anybody wants to buy it, rather than live on the money before I've done the work. It's not a good idea at all. I've seen that, that ruin writers, dare I say, of my acquaintance. Anyway, so the first few novels were chapter by chapter in advance. But even then, in the act of writing, I'd find, well, no, this doesn't work, or I don't need this, and so some of the pre-planned stuff would get thrown out. And then I suppose, I don't know, probably sometime, funny enough, you mentioned the book, sometime around The Hungry Moon, I just began to gather lots and lots of material in my notebooks and begin to get a general idea of what the major events of the narrative were going to be, and inevitably some idea of what order they would occur in on the page. And then when the thing felt, basically urgent, I'd start to write it and see, well, where do we go from here? And I increasingly do this, but increasingly I find two things. First of all, that doing it in this very organic way actually means that it's more closely constructed and more logically constructed than the stuff I'd, actually tried to work out in advance of writing it. And also it gains tremendous impetus from this process, I find, much more than, if I'd preconceived it. And I'm basically here, I'm talking to my desk to you up here on that third floor of my house, overlooking the Mersey, the river, in the distance, admittedly. But I come up here every morning. I want to surprise myself if I'm writing a new draft. I want to write stuff I didn't know I was going to write till I got here and wrote it. And that's really part of the fun of the process. And with a novel, generally speaking, these days, I won't know the ending until I get there. In fact, I'd rather not know the ending till I get there. I may have a kind of a fallback ending in mind if I can't come up with anything better. But almost certainly, the book will, in the very process of development and transformation, it will come up with a better solution or better resolution. And I like to do it that way. So it obviously it took decades of getting comfortable with the process, but that's pretty well where I am these days.
That's such an interesting eye into your process. And that leads me into a question that I had prepared for you. You've brought up instinct a few times. You're talking about, those things that you can only gain through experience. You once said that when you're working on a novel, you're at the desk at 6 a.m., 7 days a week. Do you find that having a strict routine kind of helps you to be more creative? I'm always interested in how writers best figure out how to tap into instinct or the unconscious, whether it's waking up early or, making sure there are as few variables in one's working day as possible. So if you could speak to that a little bit, we'd be very curious.
Sure. Well, now it's only very approximate when I say 6 o'clock in the morning. It's an approximation, but it's around that time for sure. And by then I've technically been working maybe an hour because I've maybe woken up an hour before that, and it's the pressure of the ideas of the material that gets me up. And maybe it makes me want to get into the desk so I can start writing. And one thing, incidentally, I have learned over the decades, the one trick, or maybe a trick technique, if you like, but the one sort of coping with writer's block mechanism, which means I never get it, is that I always compose at least the first sentence before sitting down to write. So, there's no chance that I'm going to be staring at this horrible blank and wondering what to put on it, because I've already got something, and that will almost inevitably generate, more, the rest of that paragraph or whatever it may be. Now, I have to say this also, you see, I've actually concluded it's one of those things, I guess. I think depression and sort of self-doubt is an integral part of the process for me, because I tend to wake in the morning and think, I have no ideas, I've got no creative energy. If I ever knew what I was doing, I've forgotten it now. If I had it, I've lost it. And then, something will come up. It's an image or a sentence. And I think, I've got to get up and write that down before I forget it, because God forbid, that's one thing I disagree with my old friend Stephen King about, is, he tends to say, if you forget an idea, it wasn't that good. I don't believe that. I actually think if you forget an idea, I'm always thinking, oh God, what was that idea? It was probably great, So I just never risk it. These days I use the phone more often than not as a recording device, a dictation device. But I get it down so I don't lose it for sure, whichever way I happen to do it. And it is the pressure of that material that gets me here to the desk in the morning. I have to say this actually also, I keep saying increasingly, but it is the case, it never ends, I suppose, the process of personal development, as a writer. That these days, if I wake in the middle of the night, I often have consciously to stop myself thinking about the work in progress, because if I start doing it, for sure it's going to start suggesting material, and then I have to go and note it down, which I try not to do. So I trust myself at least to get a decent night's sleep, if intermittent, and then in the morning I'm ready to open myself to this the demon that whispers in my ear and says, you've got to write this, basically. And I don't have a kind of set output. I've never been quite clear on this. Graham Greene apparently used to say he would write 500 words a day in a first draft. I've never known whether he meant he organised his material to such an extent that he could cut off at the end of a sentence that would be word 500. Or if he just stopped in the middle of a sentence, or if it was a little bit approximate. I don't know. I really don't know. Me, if I average about 500 words a day, that's fine. I'm certainly going to count it, but I can see it on the page approximately, because I always write longhand. First draft is always, pen and ink, an ordinary old cartridge fountain Parker pen, and an exercise book. Although horror upon horror. The kind of exercise book I've used for a long, mostly since I've began doing it seriously, they no longer make them, and they no longer do that format. So I've got to try and find out to live with a different format if I can. But well, if I go silent, you'll know why.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the acknowledgements page of your new novel. This dovetails nicely into a discussion that
Of
you
course I
used
did.
was it some of Tanith Lee's old notebooks that
Yes,
you?
John Caine, who is the much loved and much missed Tanith's widower. He was so kind. He actually found some that Tanith, she obviously used exactly the same thing I do, but she brought up a few that she never got around to using, and he sent them to me, and so here I am in Tanith's notebooks, as you say.
It's kind of amazing to me that a novel like that is written by hand because it's so tightly plotted. It's so well designed. There's not a
Oh, well, this
scene
is
or
part
word
of this whole
wasted.
thing, you see. This whole thing I say that I find that's how it works for me, that the whole business of allowing it to to flow, even to flow of itself. Somehow it generates its own tight structure, as you say. However, I should say this though, I've talked about the first draft. The rewrite, is ruthless. I mean, there was a time when, and I don't know when the turning point was, but there was a time when I would try and salvage as much of the first draft as possible in the final version. These days, I'll try and rid myself of or improve as much of the first draft as I possibly can. And everything is up for grabs, basically. Everything has to justify itself, or it goes, or it gets rewritten. So that version you've read won't necessarily be. Well, it's obviously the basis is there, but more and more, I kind of regard the first draft as being setting out the material so that I can see it, and then I know how to improve it, basically.
So I'm curious with a novel like that, that's all extremely interesting. Like there's a lot of thematic unity in the novel. There's a lot of stuff about intergenerational and familial tension. There are a lot of imagistic motifs. And the prose it's like the crispest prose I've read from you. It reminded me a bit of Ira Levin books like The Stepford Wives.
That's interesting. Do you know what? Because I thought of it. It wasn't an actual attempt to imitate, but when I finished it, I thought, in a way, this is my Rosemary's Baby, because one thing that's astonished me about Rosemary's Baby when I read it, because it was pretty well unique up to that point, and pretty well unique since. It's a horror novel told very largely through dialogue. And most of what happens off screen or off stage, if you like, and which kind of makes us more paranoid on Rosemary's behalf, because we can see there's more wrong. There's something that doesn't directly meet the eye, which she doesn't see, but we probably do. And I think in a way that's how Echo of Children works. But as I say, it wasn't a conscious attempt to emulate Levin, but when I thought it over, I thought, good heavens, that's the example that's shadowed in the background.
Yeah, it shows up I thought in even the prose style too. Like there's a kind of Levin-esque economy. So that's really interesting.
Well, I think that also comes from, I think I've already cited him, haven't I? But a great favourite of mine, Graham Greene. And you can see that process across his career, that he refines and distills and pares away, everything, except the absolute essentials. Because you read a very early novel like The Man Within. Greene, it's all there already. There's a wonderful early scene, a funeral scene, when the priest has a dreadful cold, and this is typical Greene. So, he's sneezing and snuffling throughout the funeral ceremony, and only Greene, I think, could have come up with this sort of a thing. But you can see it reads sort of like a first draft. There's too much material. You can see that he would have pared that down to maybe 2/3. And that is what he will do later on. And that's really, I suppose, probably true of me, that I would tend, perhaps not 2/3, but maybe the final draft of something like Echo of Children will be maybe 20% leaner than the first draft by the time I'm through with it.
That's an interesting point that you're making about Graham Greene. It reminds me, earlier you mentioned M.R. James, who also uses a lot of restraint, like the less is more adage.
Yeah.
And I read an interview with you in Publishers Weekly in which you praised James for this quality. You said, quote, "He conveyed more terror with a single sentence or even sometimes a solitary phrase than most writers achieve in a paragraph. He's still unequaled at showing just enough to suggest far worse," unquote. And having read your work, I do find that you're adept at achieving this effect. It sounds like, maybe doing like a reduction, like a
Hmm.
balsamic reduction of your writing. We're always looking for tips, but of course, some of these things, like you say, are more instinctual than others. But do you have any tips for generating that kind of unease as opposed to more overt horror?
Oh, I think basically just imply more than state, let the reader glimpse rather than see directly. Or some of the best effects I think are the ones that almost go by you without your noticing. That there's just something not quite right there, or something that kind of resonates later on. I mean, I think maybe Echo of Children had some of that. It kind of begins with the shriek of children, does it not? But then they're on a roller coaster, so that appears to be okay. But I suppose it's the way these things work for me as a reader as well. That you could sometimes, even before I know where a novel is or even a short story is going, I can think that detail is there for a reason. There's something more than just a kind of glancing bit of establishing background. There's something about that is going to figure later on. And I think maybe as a reader you kind of develop that alertness to the prose. And certainly as a writer, I try and do that where I can. I suppose it also comes down a way to trying to set out the themes as early as possible. I mean, not overstating them, but just having them present in the narrative in some embryonic way as early as possible, so that that they're already possibly beginning to resonate in our imagination. I mean, that's how it does it for me as the writer. So I do these things in the hope that they'll do it for the reader as well. Because I mean, I'm not trying to impose an experience. I'm trying to convey an experience, which isn't quite the same thing.
I love that distinction between impose versus, what was the word you used?
Convey it, convey. I mean,
Convey.
what I'm trying to do, well, I'll put it even more simply, if you will. What I'm trying to do in writing is engage my imagination, which I hope I do. Otherwise it's not. I mean, there's no point in doing it. Otherwise, it's just hack work. And having done that, I hope that it will engage the reader's imagination, and maybe you'll have something like the same experience that I have. But again, it's an odd thing for me to say, possibly as a writer of horror, but I believe it. I mean, I don't think you can control the reader's response to what you write. And I've come to the conclusion I don't think you should try and do it either. Every reader will have a different response. I mean, just visit a book group and a discussion, you'll see how many different takes there are on any one text. And I actually just think these days I just sort of celebrate that. I mean, I write it how it feels to me, and then it's out there for the reader to decide how it works for them.
Earlier on, you mentioned Stephen King, and we've been talking about M.R. James and Ira Levin. One of the things that I find most interesting about your work is how much it's in conversation with a tradition and with a field. I'm editing a book on Peter Straub right now.
Yes.
Yeah, I love his work, of
Yes,
course.
he's great.
Yeah, there's actually I don't know if you know this, but in a collection called At the Foot of the Story Tree, Bill Sheehan quotes a letter that Straub wrote to you.
Yes. Yes.
I guess Straub described Ghost Story as a big bird which stubbornly refused to fly, and the book with maybe one good scare in
I
it.
think he said it had one good scare in it. That's right. I remember that. Yes.
Yeah, obviously he was wrong, but
Well, yeah, that's right.
it builds into a bigger question I had for you, in addition to Straub, you've spoken about friendships with many legendary horror peers, including Robert Aikman, Stephen King, Clive Barker, of course, August Derleth. You mentioned several times that your wife Jenny is your first reader, but do you ever exchange manuscript drafts or discuss writing challenges with other writers in the field? Do you?
No, I don't. No. I mean, occasionally we talk, but never exchange material. No, I never really occurred to me, to be honest with you. It's I just like to do it and get it out there when I think it's I've done all I can and hope that somebody likes it. I have to say this actually, because it's true, and again, more and more so the older I get. These days, I finish. Well, I'll make the distinction. If I finish a new short story, and maybe I've been asked to do it for an anthology or something, and I send it in, I tend to think, well, they're not going to want this, they're not going to like this, but it's a short story, maybe I can market it elsewhere, or at the very least, I can put it in a collection of my own eventually. If I've done a new novel, I'll send that to my agent. I'll think, well, he's going to say one of two things. Either he'll say, well, this isn't what we expect of you, and it's nothing like what you do, and I don't think we can handle it. Or he'll say, well, this is too much like what you always do, and you've repeated yourself once too often, and we've had enough. And it's only when he says, no, we like this, and I think, oh, well, okay, I haven't lost it yet. But of course, maybe he's just saying that. Maybe he's teasing.
It's interesting you've mentioned these market pressures, for example, in a 2023 interview with the Horror Writers Association, you mentioned that the temporary collapse of horror as a commodity in the 1990s obligated you to produce crime fiction. So I was curious what it was like to be pushed into a new course of writing by external forces, and if you've experienced any other market pressures over the tenure of your long career in writing.
Well, very early on, sure. I mean, the second novel I wrote was a book called The Face That Must Die, which is fundamentally the study of somebody going gradually mad and ultimately becoming homicidal, and it's seen from within. And it is extremely dark. And all the publishers who bought my first novel and been enthusiastic about it turned this one down as being too grim, basically. Apart from my British paperback publisher, who said, well, we'll have to wait and see what the sales of the first book are like. In fact, they did very well with that, and so they did buy the second one, but it came out initially as a paperback original. I had felt, you see, it was just a natural development of the previous novel in a way. It was the next step, next stage onwards. And because of that, because it seemed at the time that nobody wanted this second book, then I did decide, with the help of my agents, both Kirby Macaulay, who was then in America, had gone, I'm afraid, and Carol Smith here in Britain, that we'd sort of concoct, what we hoped would be some kind of a commercial proposition. And I sort of cobbled together a book called variously To Wake the Dead in Britain and The Parasite in America. And I think it's a terrible ramshackle thing. It's got far too much piled into it. Some of the kind of stuff that I would develop better later on, I think, But it did do well. It sold, and people like it. People still like it. So I mean, I don't very much, but if some people espouse it, well, fair enough. And then, as you say, there did come that point in the 90s, the mid-90s, where, horror imploded for whatever reason, probably too much bad stuff. And it tends to happen, as it did with science fiction in the 50s. The boom imploded because, again, there wasn't enough good stuff to go round to be published by everybody who wanted to publish it, while it was popular. So The Face That Must Die, was a crime novel, and I'd written a couple of other crime novels as a natural part of the process, a natural stage as far as I was concerned. But being forced to do it, no, that was not pleasant at all. And I think that was probably my first experience of, waking at 3 a.m, thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to write? And trying to work up some kind of a commercial proposition, a crime novel, a crime proposition. Well, there was we'd gone back now to my having to write a synopsis, which I'd loathe, in advance, so that my agent could either propose it to a publisher or at the very least say, yeah, that sounds, it could work. Go ahead and write it, and we'll see what we can do with it. And I mean, this is slightly beside the point, but perhaps of interest that I was in probably the blackest depression of my career. And the one of the few, well, apart from Jenny, my wife, was the best thing in my life by far, and very much my support. The other thing of a quite different thing that somehow kind of got me up a bit, and this, well, I don't say it sounds strange at all, but it was the Brahms Alto Rhapsody, which is very, in some ways very much about that kind of, coming, finding, getting yourself somehow out of the abyss, which I found very moving. And somehow, music occasionally is very important to me at times, and that was one such instance. But anyway, having said all this, and moaned and bitched about the business of being required to do crime fiction, I did then come up with well, The Last Voice They Hear was the first of the books I came up with. Now, my British agent, said, write like Thomas Harris. Well, I can't write like Thomas Harris. I write like Ramsey Campbell, and that's all I can write like. I'm afraid that's what I did write like. And the first couple of chapters of that, I didn't feel engaged at all. But then came about chapter 3, and I began to, get hold of the material, and it began to feel like a bit more like something that I would have written anyway. And from that point onward, I thought, well, okay, maybe I could work with this. And the second novel I wrote in that period, a book called Silent Children, I think was probably a novel I would have written anyway, given time. It would have been, a natural occurrence. So that didn't bother me so much. But at the same time, I was very glad to get back into the field. I seem to remember, gosh, it was at, the World Horror Convention at Niagara Falls in turn of the century. And I'd had an idea for a book called The Darkest Part of the Woods, which is a supernatural horror novel. And I was being interviewed on stage by Caitlin Kiernan, in fact. And I said, look, I think maybe she asked me, what are you going to write next? I said, well, look, I've got this idea in mind. And my agent at Tor Books was in the audience and said, look, Melissa, I want to write this supernatural horror book. Is it time again? And she said, oh, go on then. I said, okay, you heard it here first. Here's my return to supernatural horror. And indeed, I've never looked back since. And these days, basically, I've got to confess, I hope in a good way, I just write what I want to write and hope people want to publish it. And so far, particularly the great folk at Flame Tree Press, who have been doing me a lot recently and picking up a lot of the backlist, they've encouraged all my foibles. So more power to them, and I hope I haven't let them down.
Like I said, I loved An Echo of Children.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I thought it was, like I said, so tight and economical and engrossing. A bit of a segue, but something I wanted to ask you about is, in addition to being steeped in a rich literary tradition, you're also obviously steeped in a deep love of cinema. You've referenced everything from Last Year at Marienbad and The Rules of the Game to The Curse of the Werewolf and the Blob. You see that cinephilia.
I've seen them all. Name a film I've not seen. Well, I'm sure you can actually, but if it's available, I've almost certainly seen it. And I'm the greatest lover of Blu-ray and the like, and the sort of restorations, by gum, this whole process appears to have led to. These wonderful, 100-year-old movies that look as if they were photographed yesterday. I mean, I'm in awe of all that, and the access to films I thought I would never see. Now, is there still that uncut copy of The Magnificent Ambersons in a shed in Brazil? So, well, we can only hope. I don't think they find it in my lifetime. It's not got long, guys, so get on with it.
I know. I'm hoping for that too. Yeah, and I mean, like, that cinephilia clearly informs novels. Like, my favorite of your books might be Ancient Images, but also Grin of the Dark, Incarnate. And you've also, of course, written a lot of criticism, and you
Mhm.
publish novelizations under the pseudonym Carl Dreadstone. So I was
do.
curious, does your love of cinema inform your approach to fiction writing? Is that something you're conscious of? Is it something you have reflected on or thought about?
Mostly as a theme, or as as material within the narrative. I don't generally think that I'm directly influenced by film in terms of prose writing, because I think they're two separate art forms. I don't know that. Well, obviously, there are writers who can. I mean, Ballard comes to mind, certainly. Particularly in his kind of compacted novels. There's those strange Marilyn Monroe narratives he did for New Worlds. But generally speaking, no, I don't think I'm hugely influenced. Having said that, I mean, Last Year Unmarried, by which I love, great favourite of mine, that did influence how I approached temporality in a couple of stories, particularly a story called Concussion, actually, an early story, which juggles with the timeline a lot. And I actually did consciously try and do in prose what Alain Resnais does in film. And whereas in Marienbad, just basically the next shot can be a year earlier, or it can be possibly never having happened at all. And there's absolutely no indication in terms of in terms of the montage, whether you have to sort that continuity out for yourself. And in Concussion, there are a couple of points, I think, where we step back several decades halfway through a sentence. And I very much wanted to have that same effect that the film had on me, and actually other Resnais films too. Muriel, which applies fundamentally the same technique to a naturalistic narrative with extraordinary results. Another huge favourite of mine. But also, I don't mind acknowledging the influence of well, not lower cinema, but perhaps more popular cinema. I mean, Carnival of Souls. Well, actually, that needs no justification from me at all. The moment that really always got to me in that is when it's Candice Hilligoss, isn't it? Is driving across the desert, and night is falling, and as she's driving along at some speed, a face looks in the car window. And that got to me in a big way, so much so that I actually incorporated the version in Incarnate. And there's also a rather more shaky horror film, but I'm still, I like shaky horror films, films that where the effects aren't quite on, and still they seem to work, and possibly in a sort of strange way, the imperfection of the effects adds to a sort of dreamlike or nightmare effect. I mean, I found this very much in Corman's Attack of the Crab Monsters, for instance, which is not a guilty pleasure at all, just a pleasure. But I'm thinking more of a movie called The Manster, which is a two-headed man movie, one of several. And there's a scene toward the end where there's the unlucky chap who's sprouted a second head is seen running along in the dark with this terrible thing lolling on his shoulder. In one way it's obviously fake, but in a way the fakery somehow adds to there's a sort of edge of nightmare to the image. And again, I like that so much that I put that into Incarnate, a version of it, towards the end. So there are my admissions. And also, of course, you're too polite or too guarded to have said to pointed out to the audience that I've also written a study of the Three Stooges, possibly my magnum opus. There you are, the thing I hope to go down in history for.
I think you can wear that with pride.
But there you are, you see, because they crept into the narrative. It's an odd thing, because before I wrote the book, they began to come in. I mean, there's a story called Needing Ghost, where somebody's watching the Stooges on television. I've no idea why I put that in. Although I would just have to say this about, and this is a bit of a left turn in our discussion, but Needing Ghost was a novella that I wrote, I think back in '89, I think. And it was written immediately after Midnight Sun, of which I've previously spoken. And Midnight Sun was probably the most difficult novel I ever wrote in terms of writing it, because I was aiming so high and I was constantly feeling I'm not getting there. But Needing Ghost was a strange kind of relaxation after it. Yeah, I was commissioned by Debbie Beale over at Legend Books, or Legend Books, as she used to call it, to do a novella in a series that, she'd had various people do novellas for. And for a while, I tried to, well, I kind of demurred because I didn't quite know, I didn't think I had an idea for a novella, because I very much believe, to write in a particular form, I have to have a reason for it to be in that form, and not a long short story and not a novel that's been cut down, but it has to be. It needs to be that sort of in between length. And I eventually came up with an idea that seemed to me possibly to work, and so I started writing Kneading Ghost. And after about 3 days, I began to think, well, this is getting stranger than I anticipated. What do I do now? The only thing seemed to be, well, follow it, see where it leads. And I was seriously coming up to this desk every morning with almost no idea where I was going, just, impatient to find out where it would take me today. And it was like dreaming onto the page. Seriously, I've never had that before or since like that. And it just had such an impetus that it was almost like automatic writing. It was almost coming faster at me than I could get down. And I think it's probably everything that I've ever written, certainly everything I've written since I was, I've been rewriting very thoroughly, that I've rewritten least. I found least in it to rewrite. It seemed to me it had come out almost so fluidly and come out so right that there was nothing for me to do with it. It just had to be what it was. Again, I set it up with some trepidation, but luckily Debbie thought, yeah, well, she liked it, and it duly appeared. But yes, that's right. The Stooges do appear in that. Somebody's watching them on television, but I've no idea why. It was just there. It was in my subconscious, and it emerged, and it then they kind of show up. They show up in the Grin of the Dark, actually, in a way. The scene where the poor guy is at the cash machine in Amsterdam, and there are three people behind him who clearly are some sort of comic routine of a nightmare kind. But they're there all right, and I try to celebrate my experience of them in Six Stooges and Counting, this monograph. And if people don't know why it's called Six Stooges and Counting, well, buy the book, because I'm not going to tell you.
It's so exciting to think about how, I don't know, snippets of things we hear or watch make their way into our work. And that's interesting what you say about Kneading Ghost too. I have a question trying to stitch this all together, but basically prose has its limitations and there's an acoustics to language, but when you're reading it on the page, it's not necessarily there. I did read a 2008 interview with you in Writers News Weekly, wherein you express an interest in kind of sound, notably patterns of stress and tone of dialogue. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on sound and what role it plays on the page, generally speaking. And then, like you said, sometimes, it's interesting to me that if you're somebody who cares about sound, that something like Kneading Ghosts, that it just came out more quickly or fluidly than usual, if there's any kind of rhyme or reason, or if you do anything do you read aloud, or how do you kind of manage the sound when you're writing?
I think I hear it in my head. I think it's as simple as that I hear the rhythm of the prose and the actual assonance, if you like, of the sentence. And often enough I do try to construct a sentence so it does have a certain musicality, if you like. I don't read aloud in order to do that, but I do a lot of reading aloud, just at events. I do. I like doing that. I've done a couple of recordings, though I think probably they're presently out of print. But actually, I do maybe some stuff online. If people have a look, I think there probably are a couple of readings I've done that are out there that on YouTube or somewhere like that. And yes, I think from a relatively early age, I think in terms of once I started writing seriously, that I wanted the prose to have that kind of rhythm and yes, if you like, I try to avoid the one thing I think you must avoid is inadvertent rhyming and other things, too much alliteration and too much echoing of sound. is going to overload the sentence. I mean, a writer, I think, who does go too far in that direction, ultimately is M.P. Shiel. At his best, he can be very striking, but some of his later work is so mannered, I think, in terms of the order that it seems to be more about the sound of the language more than about the meaning. I think you've got to keep those two things in balance. But I mean, I suppose the other writer we've not yet cited, who seems to be in much of his narrative work is akin to poetry, and possibly my favourite writer in English is Nabokov. And I may as well confess, the first book of his I ever read was Lolita, and it was one of those happy accidents. I mean, I'm a great believer in the happy accident in writing. I just finished my first book, which is my Imitation Lovecraft book, was the first book of mine that was ever published, and very much after the manner of Lovecraft, certainly using concepts Lovecraftian concepts rather than taking. I didn't want to recycle his material, but spin off from it maybe. But the point was this: I'd finished this first book of mine, and almost immediately afterwards I found a copy. Well, I bought a copy of Lolita, and I admit, partly because it was supposedly a naughty book, a forbidden book, though it had just now been published in Britain. In fact, I think that the copy I got was a tie-in with the Kubrick film. I was originally reading it, I think, partly because it had this reputation of being, something that had originally been possibly banned. It wasn't, in fact, but it might have been. But, I read maybe a couple of pages, certainly just a few pages, and it was apparent to me that so much more was here than I was expecting. So much richer in terms of the celebration of language and the obliqueness of narrative approach and the comedy, for heaven's sake, the fact that he could be comic on such an unlikely and almost unapproachable theme. And it just bowled me over. And as soon as I finished reading it, I bought everything else I could find of Nabokov and fell in love with that. That's luck would have it. Pale Fire came out almost immediately after in paperback, and that just astonished me all over again, and still does actually. I mean, anybody who doesn't know it, it's not indescribable, but it's impossible to convey the experience. I mean, for those who don't know, it's a novel in the form of a 999-line poem and a 300-odd page commentary on the poem. And it's funny, and it's disturbing, and it's suspenseful, and it's a crime novel. And if you don't see how that could possibly be, well, now's your chance, and I wish you joy of it, because I think it's just an astounding achievement. And I think to come back to what we were talking about, I think that's where some of this comes from. The fact, Nabokov's love of language, that changed my approach to writing, almost overnight. And I wasn't imitating Nabokov in the way that imitated Lovecraft, but I was certainly learning from him. And I think, you can see a kind of turning point in my writing almost immediately. And, everything loosens up, the style, the narrative approach, again, I use the term again, the obliqueness of how it deals with the themes and the material. And I think that Lovecraft was my first key influence. Nabokov was the second one, which might sound like an unlikely combination, but that's what you got. That's me.
Well, they're both superb prose stylists. And as you're talking about the music of language, I'm actually in celebration of this season right now, I'm reading Alone with the Horrors, and your story, The Voice of the Beach, stood out to me as the language is so gorgeous.
Well, thank you.
It also stands out to me as a reflection of a common thematic preoccupation of yours, which you've talked about before, this fixation on what is perceived versus what is real. You're really good at depicting a sort of shimmer on the outskirts of character perception of something that they can't quite accept or kind of subsume into their sense of reality. Yeah. I was just curious to hear a little bit from you about that theme, how it shows up in your work, what interests you about it, where that comes from. I think I heard you in an interview with Stephen Jones on Miskatonic London. You talked about maybe a childhood origin to some of that.
Oh, yes.
I don't know. I'd
Very
just be
much
curious.
so.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I'm afraid. You see, we get into the dark, the shadows of my childhood here. But why not? It's clearly, excuse me, the source of much of what I write, certainly thematically. Well, straightforwardly, my mother was an undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. I mean, as far as I know, not diagnosed, certainly not in my lifetime until virtually the end of her life, and may probably, as far as I know, not earlier than my birth either. And 3 years old, I think. I mean, my parents had this ghastly argument, which ended with them fighting over who got to shut the front door. And my mother shoved her hand through a pane of glass in the door, and insisted that my father had deliberately, shut the door on her hand, which was not the case. But she had to be taken to hospital because she was bleeding copiously, all of which was pretty harrowing stuff for a 3-year-old to experience. But the point was, I knew that what she said was not what I had seen. I'd seen the door, her put her hand through the glass, and here was the damn pane, shattered with blood on it. And I could only assume the neighbours whom she called in to take her to the hospital and look after me while she was taken off, that they presumably would, just indulging her, and going along with her story rather than argue, because obviously you don't want to do that under all those circumstances. But at that moment, I think, it became apparent to me that what she perceived and what was real were two different things often. And really, I had to make that distinction throughout my childhood and indeed early adulthood, And so it just became part of my everyday experience. I took it for granted, really. But then, I kind of investigate and interrogate it in the fiction. But I mean, obviously, sometimes. I mean, Doug Winter, I think it was, said that I was born to write horror in a sense, or at least that childhood explained why I write in the field. Well, I mean, I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not denigrating Doug by any means or his idea, but I think, I've asked myself, is that the case? And obviously the answer is I don't know, because I'm asking myself, if I weren't who I am, who would I be? And how would any of us know that? But I do think I would always have loved horror fiction and the supernatural and supernatural dread. But it's very possible that some of the thematic preoccupations of my stuff certainly have their roots in my early years, my early experience. And above all, I think, as you say, that theme of what is perceived and what may not be real. And I imagine I'm still writing about it right now, and I imagine I always shall.
First of all, just to comment on what you just said, Ramsey, I mean, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think we all have, I don't know, like I really admire the writer Joyce Carol Oates. I find she has certain fixations. I don't know much. She's quite a private person, but regardless, it's like I always love when authors have fixations. I like to see how they approach it. Yes. I find that a lot of horror writers, myself and Mike included, we tend to revisit the same thing, kind of rehearse what happened to us. So I feel like you touched on this earlier in a 2023 interview, the same one I referred to earlier with Horror Writers Association. You mentioned something that I found comforting, I guess. You said you still experience frustration and uncertainty when you begin a new story. Obviously, I'm sorry to hear this for your sake, but at the same time, I do find it reassuring because it's so relatable. And you said that something about this earlier, but do you think these emotions are an inevitable feature of the artistic process? And how do you work to tame those discouraging emotions or thoughts?
Well, it's a good one. The immediate answer is yes, I do think they're inevitable, certainly for me. The old imposter syndrome. I think more of us suffer from it than necessarily would admit to it, But I'm happy to admit to it. But I think the thing is this, I think I've put it very simply. Intellectually, I know this is how it works for me. I know, in the morning, I may very well get up tomorrow morning or, wake up tomorrow morning thinking yet again, I've lost it, or, I never had it, or basically, I just have no creative energy, and I know that's going to get what is going to happen. But knowing it intellectually is not the same thing as experiencing it emotionally. And the only thing I can do is let the process, that emotion act as a kind of spur to creativity. And that's how it works. And maybe that's how it has to work. I mean, Jack Sullivan once asked me, why didn't I ever go to therapy? And, did I feel that basically therapy might do away with my creative impulse? And yeah, I think the answer is definitely yes. I wouldn't risk that in case I ended up, no longer being what I am. I'd rather be what I am and suffer it for the sake of writing what I write.
Part of what I guess horror is always getting at too, and this relates to some degree to the relationship between what is known versus what is perceived, is the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious selves. And we've been talking a lot about the novel Incarnate. I feel like it's really kind of getting at that.
Yes.
So yeah, I see a preoccupation with the unconscious in your work as well.
Well, it's interesting because Incarnate was really the first novel where I did cut loose. While I had prepared a synopsis, it was actually George Walsh, who was a very good chap, my editor at Macmillan in those days, and this is probably almost the last synopsis I ever did. And he liked the idea, but he suggested one that there should be more unity of time and place, and also there should be one character who was more decisively central, because as the book, well, even now, of course, the book has several parallel narratives and several parallel characters, if you like. but it's Molly Wolfe, isn't it, who is the I think the core of the narrative, the one on towards whom everything homes, if you like. And I found his ideas very stimulating suggestions, and so I duly incorporated those, and those actually did away with some of what I was going to do. And one, I forget who it was now, but one complete character just got thrown out, and so never appeared in the book at all. But that novel was really the first where I began to let my unconscious loose, if you like, and let it take over as much as I could. And in fact, there's a key moment there. Indeed, now I think about it, this was the point where I decided I'm not going to try and control the reader's reaction anymore. Whereas in something like The Parasite, I think the whole thing, kind of strains to do that, strains to be scary. And for that very reason, falls short, among other reasons, actually. But there's an early-ish scene in Incarnate where one of the characters who was a stamp dealer, and his wife, who was a carer, has brought home this mysterious figure who then becomes a tenant in their house, and is clearly beginning to affect their reality. And he's a stamp dealer, as I say, and he's looking over a sheet of first day issue stamps, and all of which in England always have the Queen's head, or now the King's head, the monarch's head on them. And all these little heads begin to turn towards him and squeak at him. And I thought, what is this? Is this frightening? What is it? It's sort of comical. It's dreamlike. And I thought, well, it fits the theme of the book, and I'll leave it there. It goes in, and whatever it makes the reader feel is up to the reader. And that was the precise moment I thought, I'm not going to try and do it to the reader any longer. I'm going to try and communicate to the reader, but that's a quite different thing. And that was a kind of a crucial turning point, I think.
I don't know, there's a kind of dream logic to that novel that's very unique in your oeuvre, I think.
Yes.
It's maybe not a terribly exciting closing question, but we always like to end by asking our guests, have you read anything recently that has particularly excited you or stood out in some way?
Well, yes, there's a new youngish, well, certainly young compared to me, everybody's young, a newish British writer called Gareth Wood, who is writing novels that I suppose could best be described as a sort of conflation of extreme urban grime and the cosmic. At Night, White Bracken was his first novel that I've read. and the more recent one is To Those From Below, both of which I think are quite remarkable, and very inventive, a real engaged imagination, and his sort of monsters, which kind of come out of the urban environment, are second to none. And actually, he's going to be at the World Fantasy Convention in Brighton over Halloween, and so am I. So if anybody can make it, come and see us.
Fantastic. Yes. Anyone who's able to make it out to that, you should go. We also encourage our listeners to buy, read, and review the new novel. It's excellent. I think it's some of Ramsey Campbell's best writing, which is, of course, saying a lot. Is there anything else you'd like to plug or mention before we wrap up here today, Ramsey? Thank you again so much for taking the time. It means the world.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Well, I don't know really. There's well, I guess if you want a retrospective of my stuff, these days PS Publishing in Britain, they do 2 fat collections of my stories called Phantasmagorical Stories. And those are now out in big trade paperbacks, so they won't break the bank. And taken together, it's about 1,000 pages of stuff of mine, almost up to the present day, not quite, but it's a selection I would stand by. And there's also a sort of companion volume called The Village Killings, which collects all the novellas, in fact, including Needing Ghosts that we talked about earlier, and also The Village Killings, which is, well, again, this may sound strange, but my sort of tribute to and critique of simultaneously Agatha Christie, whose work I mean, look, you won't get the greatest prose in the world, but you will find great linguistic ingenuity. And I've come to admire that quite a bit. The extraordinary way she can kind of make you think you read something and you didn't, or make you think you saw something and you didn't. So it's coming right back to my theme again. We can't get away from it. Basically, the world surrounds me with my theme. Whatever that tells you, I have no idea. It's called being an obsessive, I suspect.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Well, Miriam and Michael, thank you for having me. It was great. Thank you.
Best of luck in Brighton at the end of the month. I hope it's a lovely time.
I think it'll be good.